interesting quote. Of course, you're quoting one of the arch terrorists of the world today. That's one thing we have to understand. But it was the support for the Balfour Declaration that helped the decolonization process by having the Axis powers go down and have the colonial process leave the region. There's a direct quote from the Pew report that the Balfour Declaration was actually the impetus for the decolonization of the region entirely. That was the first statement giving independence to one of the nations in the area, which was the Jewish nation. Until the time the Balfour Declaration came into being, there was no nationalist movement per se on the behalf of any of the Arab countries. At the time there were a scattering of tribes, agglomeration of tribes, but the Balfour Declaration was the first statement to understand that there were regional interests and regional tribes and regional nations that were working or would like to work toward having some sort of independence. One of the colonial powers that I think everyone looks at is, of course, the British. One power that people don't look at is the Arab colonial power. People forget, or tend to forget, that there were 7 Arab armies that attacked Israel the day that it declared independence. These Arab armies came from outside the area. These weren't Arab armies. The Arab armies of Iraq, and the Arab armies of Syria, and the Arab army of Egypt don't belong in Palestine. They never belonged in Palestine. They had nothing to do with Palestine. And they attacked Israel as colonialist powers. And in fact, some of the colonialism that we saw that happened in the earlier part of the 20th century continued, with Jordan taking over part of a country, the West Bank, that had nothing to do and never was given to the Jordan and never had any intention of being Jordanian. But the Jordanians illegally occupied that area for many, many years. Egypt administered the Gaza Strip. If Egypt was not a colonial power, then what is a colonial power? It's a reasonable question whether or not there would have been a Palestinian national movement if it wasn't for the Jewish Zionist national movement. The Palestinian movement was a reaction to the Jewish Zionist movement, because up until that time, even most of the Arab leaders of that time looked at Palestine, southern Palestine, as being part of Syria. And that again is something that if you look at the primary documentation, go back at the Pew report, you'll see that that was recognized that way. So the Palestinian national movement, and the terminology is also very important, because you didn't hear the term Palestinian national movement until much later on. Before then, you really heard Arab Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians. So the term Palestinian applied just as well to Jews as it did to Arabs at the time. The idea today that a Palestinian is only an Arab really comes from the fact that the Jews really have their own country. It's called Israel today, so Jews are called Israelis. But before 1948, Jews were called Palestinians, those who lived in Palestine, as did Arabs. So I think there would be a real question, if it wasn't for the Zionist movement, what would have been the fate of the Palestinian people? Would they have been just part of Syria and become Syrians, or would they have had, indeed, an independent Palestinian state? You know, when someone calls Israel a colonial state, there's a real irk factor in there, and it irks me to the nth degree. Because if Israel's a colonial state, it means that I'm a colonialist. And if I'm a colonialist, where do I come from? Where do I belong? Now, I may sound like I come from Brooklyn, but that doesn't mean that I have any roots in Brooklyn. The reason I sound like I come from Brooklyn is because I was born in Brooklyn to parents that had nothing to do with Brooklyn, that had nothing to do with the United States, came there as refugees, spent a number of years there and left and came to where they belong, which is Israel. The fact that people like Papay and people like Chomsky speak of Israel as a colonialist nation really goes to something that's really more deep, and that's the fact that Jews have no rights to live in the land of Israel. That's basically what they're saying. Because my roots are here, the Jewish people have their roots here, and it's not a colonialist issue. If you're going to use the term colonialist Israel, that means the residents of Israel are colonialist people and they came from somewhere. Now, where did they come from? And you'll find people who say, well, they belonged in Europe, and we know what happened over there. We know how the Europeans felt about the Jews being part of Europe. Anyone that thinks that Judaism is a religion is making a big mistake. Judaism not only is a nation, but Jews look at themselves as a nation. There's nowhere in the Bible that speaks about the religion of Israel. But the Bible does speak about Am Yisrael, B'nai Yisrael, the people of Israel, the children of Israel. There's a national identity. And if you take a look at the practice of Jews around the world today, you'll have Jews that are walking around in traditional religious garb. Some of them will be wearing long side curls. Some of them will be abstain from work on the Sabbath, and you have others that will consider themselves proud Jews and work on the Sabbath and do all kinds of things that the religion of Judaism may not hold 100%. So the idea of having a national identity is really more important than having a religious identity. And what Shlomo Zand and Nomo Finkelstein do not speak about is this national identity of the Jewish people. Before there was YouTube, before there were telephones, before there were radios, before there were any means of communications, you had Jews that were living in the far reaches of a shtetl in Europe that every Passover sat and spoke about a certain story of Jews leaving the land of Egypt. You'll find another Jew that was sitting outside of a cave in Yemen somewhere that was saying the same thing. Now these Jews did not speak the same language, except having the language of prayer of Hebrew being consistent, but their language, their day-to-day language was different. Their outside dress was different. Their interaction with the world was different. One was more in Europe, one was in the Middle East. Yet they both had the same tradition, the same story that hasn't changed for a couple of thousand years. And that's how history was passed on from father to son, from mother to daughter, from generation to generation.